She was erased from her own legacy until her father's final letter gave her the key to everything. After years of silence, Madeline returns to the Whitmore estate, expecting grief, but finds a hidden war of betrayal, fraud, and stolen identity. When the will is read, secrets unravel, exposing a con that spans across states and across bloodlines. Armed with her father's last plan, she must confront the people who tried to destroy her and choose between revenge and rebirth. This is not just a story of justice. It's the story of a daughter who refused to stay buried. Welcome to Jeremy Gardens. The roses were still blooming, the same white roses her father had planted the summer Madeline turned 25, when he still believed in her marriage, her future, and the dream she was meant to inherit. Now they stood tall in defiance of the decay all around them, proof that something once beautiful could survive neglect. Madeline stepped through the wrought iron gate of the Whitmore estate in New Haven, Connecticut. The gravel path curled around the hedges, clinging to the petals like a quiet warning. It had been 2 years since she'd walked these grounds. 2 years since she'd been escorted out of her own home under the guise of family peace. 2 years since her father had looked at her with eyes too tired to fight for her. Now, Thomas Whitmore was gone. 3 weeks in the ground, and she had returned not for closure, not even for grief, but for the truth he might have left behind. She hadn't called ahead. She didn't care. The funeral had been a parade of crocodile tears and staged sympathy with Sierra Holt, the woman who used to be her husband's secretary and was now the self-appointed lady of the manor, wearing black like it was couture, not mourning. Madeline had sat in the back row, invisible to the new order. But today, there were no mourners, just roses and secrets. She was halfway up the path when the click of designer heels echoed behind her, sharp and smug. "Well, well, still playing in the dirt, I see." Madeline didn't turn. Never. That voice was an infection she'd tried to cut from memory, but it still crawled back in like mold under a sealed window. "Sierra," she said evenly, fingers tightening around the strap of her leather satchel. "What brings you outside this early? Plotting requires natural light." Sierra let out a soft, pitying laugh. "I just wanted a little air before the reading. James and I thought it would be better if we all entered the process calmly. No need to stir drama in front of the cameras. Cameras, of course." Madeline turned to face her. Sierra was immaculate as always. Perfectly tailored coat, eyes too bright for grief, and lips painted the exact shade of manipulation. "You think you're walking into an inheritance," Madeline said, voice low. "I think I'm walking into what James and I deserve," Sierra replied smoothly. 17 years of loyalty to your father. Golf games, family dinners. He treated James like a son. Madeline's stare sharpened, and he treated me like a stranger after you got your claws in him. Sierra's smile twitched at the corners. Well, time has a way of revealing character. Madeline stepped closer, lowering her voice. Yes, and I intend to reveal every last one of yours. Before Sierra could respond, Madeline turned back toward the garden. Her breath caught. There, beneath the oldest rosebush, her father's favorite, something stuck out from the soil. A small corner of yellowing paper, half covered in dirt and dew. She dropped to her knees, heart hammering, and carefully pulled it free. An envelope, handwritten, her name in her father's hand. Madeline blinked hard, throat tightening as she turned it over. It was sealed and heavy. Sierra's voice faded behind her as she stood, clutching the letter like a lifeline. The chill of the morning seemed to pull back just a little, as if even the air had paused to witness what came next. Without a word, she walked toward the greenhouse. She had never stepped inside since she left, but her father always told her, some flowers need a harsher season to bloom. Now she understood. She wasn't here to mourn. She was here to dig. The greenhouse smelled of memory. Madeline stood just inside the glass threshold, letting the humid air press against her face. Her father's orchids still hung in careful rows, each one thriving in its designated nook, each bloom a quiet defiance against the coldness outside. Someone had been caring for them. That realization landed with an ache. He hadn't been entirely alone at the end. She stepped further in. The gravel crunched softly beneath her boots, the same way it had when she was 12 and came here to escape her mother's death, and again at 20, when she had run here after discovering Nathaniel's first betrayal. This place had always been sanctuary, and now it might be the vault. She slipped the envelope from her coat pocket and held it in both hands. The flap was still sealed, the wax brittle from age and neglect. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My dearest Madeline, if you're reading this, then it means Sierra has begun circling the estate like a vulture, and I'm likely no longer around to hold the line. I made mistakes. I let her too close. But I also made preparations. The key I left you will open the bottom drawer of my old desk. Inside you'll find the real story, the one I didn't have time to tell you in person. You once asked me what chess taught me about life. The answer is simple. Sometimes, to protect the queen, you let the pawn fall. But you were never a pawn, Madeline. You were the plan. Love always, Dad. She closed her eyes. The words were a gut punch, half an apology, half a command. Her father hadn't trusted the legal system alone. He had trusted her. She turned toward the workbench at the far end of the greenhouse. The desk hadn't moved in 20 years. Dusk shimmered along its edges like a forgotten constellation. She pulled open the bottom drawer with the key still clutched in her hand. It opened with a soft click. Inside, a thick folder, a flash drive, and another note, written in quick, slanted cursive. Take this to Julie. Only her. She knows what to do. Madeline didn't hesitate. She scooped the contents into her satchel, shut the drawer, and exited the greenhouse without another glance. The cold air outside hit her like a slap. Sierra was nowhere in sight now, probably back inside, preening for the camera crew. Madeline walked quickly down the driveway and slid into her car, locking the doors out of habit. As she started the engine, her phone buzzed. A name appeared on the screen. Julie Monroe. She answered without hesitation. Julie, it's me. Julie's voice was calm, but clipped. Are you alone? Yes, I found something. A letter from my father, a key, a drawer, and a folder full of... I know what it is, Julie interrupted gently. He told me you might find it today. Madeline gripped the steering wheel tighter. How long have you known? 7 months, Julie said. He came to me right after his diagnosis. He wanted a safety net. Not for him, for you. Madeline let that sink in as she stared at the windshield. The frost had started to melt, the morning light cutting through like quiet revelation. I'm coming to you now, she said. There's more. I think. He recorded something. There was silence on the line. Then Julie said, I'll be ready. As Madeline pulled out of the driveway, the estate loomed behind her in the mirror. White stone, tall windows, and behind it all, the greenhouse, like a lung still breathing for a man already buried. She didn't know what she'd find next, but for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid. She was armed. Julie's office was nothing like Madeline remembered. It used to smell like old books and fresh ink, a quiet kind of power. Now it was steel and glass, modern, clinical, and cold. Just like the world Madeline had been forced to navigate ever since she'd been cast out of her family's empire. Julie stood as Madeline entered, her dark suit immaculate, her expression unreadable except for the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't speak, only gestured to the conference table. Madeline placed the satchel down carefully and slid the folder toward her. Julie opened it without a word. One by one, she pulled out the documents. Financial records, photographs, printed email chains, hand-signed statements. With each page, the room seemed to tighten, the air growing heavier. "You were right," Madeline said quietly. He didn't trust the system. He trusted a system he built himself. Julie nodded. "Your father knew Sierra wasn't just after his money. He knew she was something more, something cracked." Madeline lowered her voice. "He said I was the plan." At that, Julie finally looked up, her eyes steady. "He meant it. He left you the pieces. Our job is to move them at the right time." Madeline pulled out the flash drive and handed it over. Julie plugged it into her laptop without hesitation. A folder popped up immediately. Failsafe. Inside, dozens of files, all time-stamped. Julie clicked on the first. The screen showed grainy security footage. Sierra in the guest room handing an envelope of cash to a nurse Madeline didn't recognize. The audio was muffled, but enough to hear words like "advance" and "he's confused enough already." Madeline's stomach turned. She was bribing his caregivers. Julie nodded. To claim your father was no longer of sound mind, that the updates to his will were the product of confusion or coercion. "But the will still stands, right?" Madeline asked. "That depends," Julie said carefully, "on who accepts the inheritance first. And when." Madeline blinked. "Explain." Julie reached into her own briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope, identical in style to the one Madeline had found in the greenhouse. "This," she said, "is the quotel. It's a supplemental clause. Your father had it notarized 2 days before he died. It activates the moment someone outside his bloodline accepts any portion of the estate." "And what does it do?" Madeline asked. Julie's smile was razor thin. "It triggers a full legal audit, releases all the evidence your father compiled, and nullifies any asset transfer tainted by fraud or coercion." Madame leaned back, letting the weight of it settle in her bones. He set a trap. Julie looked almost proud. He baited them with exactly what they wanted, and once they bite, they lose everything. Madeline finished. Julie closed the folder. "Tomorrow's will reading will be their downfall, but we have to let them believe they've won first." Madeline glanced at the flash drive still glowing in the laptop's port. "Then let's make sure the fall is hard." She stood, brushing invisible dust from her coat. Her pulse had steadied. The dread had shifted into focus, into clarity. She no longer felt like someone crawling through the dark. She had a path now, lit by every lie Sierra thought she'd buried. "Julie," she said, her voice sharper now, forged with intent. "Tomorrow, we let them dig their own graves." Julie simply nodded, already preparing the final documents. As Madeline walked to the door, she felt her father's presence at her back, not as a ghost, but as a guide. The old man had always believed in strategy, and this time, he'd made sure his daughter had the final move. The wind had picked up by the time Madeline returned to the estate. The afternoon sky was a shade darker, and the clouds hung low like they were holding their breath. She parked at the far edge of the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, watching the house through the windshield. The mansion looked unchanged, white columns, symmetrical windows, trimmed hedges, but it no longer felt like home. It looked like a crime scene waiting to be uncovered. She stepped out with the flash drive secured in her coat pocket. Julie had made copies. One would go to the probate court, one would be held with the estate's secondary council, and one stayed with Madeline, her personal safeguard in case Sierra decided to accelerate whatever last-ditch plan she had left. Inside, the house was quiet except for the faint sounds of furniture being moved upstairs. She climbed the main staircase slowly, half expecting to find Sierra giving orders to interior decorators in preparation for her new role as Lady Whitmore. But instead she found something else, a voice, low, male, familiar, coming from the study. Madeline paused at the door. It was slightly ajar. "I told you this would backfire," Nathaniel's voice snapped. "We should have waited, pushed for a quiet transfer, not this circus." "And I told you," Sierra replied. that the media attention would help legitimize the transition. No one questions what they see on camera. Nathaniel laughed bitterly. You think a photo op will erase the fact that she's back? That she's watching everything we do? She has no proof, Sierra hissed. Whatever Thomas gave her, it won't hold up. Madeline's fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe. Her pulse quickened, but not from fear. It was something else now. Confirmation. The way Sierra's voice faltered ever so slightly. She was scared. Beneath the practiced venom, she knew. Madeline stepped back, retraced her steps quietly, and slipped into the hallway leading to her father's office. The room still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and varnished oak. The curtains had been drawn, but the afternoon light spilled through the edges, casting soft lines on the floor. She went to the desk, where it all began. She knew every drawer, every panel, every false bottom. As a child, she'd once hidden a locket under the second drawer. After a fight with her mother, that drawer now held something far more dangerous. She opened it, retrieved a small stack of legal letters, each marked with her father's signature and a date. Some less than 48 hours before his death. Among them was a document labeled Contingency 7, Statement of Mental Clarity, signed, notarized, backed by medical evaluation from his physician at Yale New Haven Hospital. That alone would shatter any claim Sierra tried to make about mental incompetency. Madeline placed it in her file folder and scanned the rest quickly. Then she froze. An envelope, smaller than the others, her name on it again, but this time in different handwriting. Henry. She tore it open. Inside was a short note. If you're reading this, it means I've chosen side. I'm sorry it took me this long. There's more I need to tell you, but not here. Meet me in the West Garden after sundown. Come alone. For a moment the air thickened. Henry, her brother, the one who'd stood beside Sierra at the funeral, the one who hadn't looked her in the eye. Had he been lying to them all? She tucked the letter into her coat and looked out the study window. The sun was beginning to fall, casting long shadows across the lawn. If Henry had something to confess, it could change everything, or it could destroy the last person she hadn't completely lost. Either way, she'd be there. The West Garden had always been Henry's favorite. Madeline remembered how he used to escape there with a sketchbook, drawing crooked versions of the estate or doodling superheroes in battle. It was tucked behind the greenhouse, shielded by high hedges and a broken iron bench their father never got around to fixing. At twilight it turned golden, silent, forgotten, safe. Now it felt like neutral ground. She arrived just as the last trace of sun dipped below the trees. The air smelled of damp soil and something floral she couldn't name. Henry was already there, sitting on the broken bench, hands clasped between his knees. He looked nothing like the confident man who had stood beside Nathaniel and Sierra at the funeral. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt wrinkled. There were shadows under his eyes, the kind that came from more than just grief. He stood when he saw her, but didn't come closer. "You came," he said. "You left a letter," Madeline replied. "And you never were one for drama." He gave a tired smile. "Seems I'm making up for lost time." They stood in silence for a moment, two figures surrounded by thorns and memory. Madeline broke it first. "Why now, Henry? Why me?" He pulled something from his coat. A check, crisp, untouched. $500,000 made out to his name. Because this was supposed to buy my silence. Madeline stared at it, her chest tightening. "She gave it to me 3 weeks ago," he continued, "the day after Dad's funeral. Said all I had to do was say he was confused, that the final will was forged, that Madeline was desperate for control." Her throat burned. "And you didn't take it?" He shook his head. "No, I gave it to Dad. That night." You should have seen his face, Mads. He wasn't angry, just disappointed I waited that long. Madeline sat down slowly on the stone ledge across from him. Her legs felt unsteady, like the ground had shifted beneath them. He told me about the flash drive, the folder, the codicil, Henry said. Said he needed me to pretend, that if Sierra believed I was on her side, she'd get comfortable. Start talking. Madeline's voice was barely a whisper. And did she? Henry reached into his phone and tapped a few buttons. A recording started, Sierra's voice, clipped and sharp. Once the old man's gone, we'll challenge the will. With your testimony and James's connection, it's ours. Laura. Madeline. She won't see it coming. Madeline closed her eyes. The sound of Sierra's voice, so smug, so certain, made her stomach twist. There's more, Henry said. I have 3 recordings, 2 meetings, 1 bribe attempt. Dad wanted everything cataloged. Madeline opened her eyes slowly. He knew it was all coming. Henry nodded. He knew, and he trusted us to finish it. Us. The word hung in the air between them like a prayer or a curse. I should hate you, Madeline said, voice trembling. You stood there beside them, watched them humiliate me, watched Dad fade. I know, he said, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it, but I'm here now, and I've got your back. No matter what happens tomorrow. Madeline looked at him, truly looked, for the first time in years, and for the first time she saw her brother, not the silent bystander, not the coward, but the boy who once built her a birdhouse from scrap wood, the teenager who taught her how to drive when their father was too busy, the man who finally chose right, even if it was almost too late. She nodded once. Then let's finish this. The study lights were dim when they stepped back inside, but the atmosphere pulsed with urgency. Julie was already there, standing over the long mahogany desk, sorting documents into labeled folders with methodical precision. Her coat was off, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly undone. More war strategist than lawyer now. Madeline handed her the phone. There are 3 files, she said, all of them recorded by Henry. The last one's the most damning. Julie plugged the phone into her laptop and pulled the audio files up on screen. The room fell quiet as Sierra's voice filled the space once more. We time it with the reading. Nathaniel accepts first. You wait a day, then file the objection. That's when we leak the photos. Frame it like she manipulated him before he died. Emotional blackmail. The court loves that narrative. Julie's jaw tightened. She had it all planned, Madeline said. Right down to how she'd spin it to the media. Not anymore, Julie replied. We're going to let her walk right into her own trap. Cameras rolling. On her terms. That's what your father wanted. Henry pulled out the final piece. A thin manila envelope labeled Westview Storage, Unit 14D. He laid it on the table. I picked it up this morning, he said. Dad rented it 2 months before he died. Inside were duplicates of everything. Photos, recordings, financial statements, plus a flash drive with video. Madeline leaned in. Video of what? Julie connected the flash drive to the laptop. A file popped up, labeled simply Confrontation. She hit play. The screen flickered to life, revealing the inside of Thomas Whitmore's study. The same desk. The same leather chair, only this time her father, Kyle, was in it. Thinner, paler, but still imposing in his silence. Across from him sat Sierra, legs crossed, mouth curled in a cold, confident smile. I know what you are, Thomas said calmly. I've read your history, Jennifer. Madeline felt the air leave her lungs. Jennifer, that was her real name. Sierra, or Jennifer Anist, as her records would later confirm, blinked. You have no proof. Thomas smiled. No? Then what do you call this? He reached into the desk and pulled out a folder. Employment records. bank transfers, alias registrations, fraud charges dismissed under a different name. Jennifer's face tightened. You were sloppy, he continued. Arrogant. You thought an old man wouldn't check. And yet here I am, she sneered. Your son's wife, heir apparent to this estate. Thomas leaned forward, voice like a blade. Not for long. The video paused as Julie hit the spacebar. There's more, she said, but this is enough for court, more than enough. Henry sank into the chair across from her, eyes dark with fatigue. So what now? Now, Julie said, we wait. Madeline looked out the window. The lawn was bathed in silver moonlight. Somewhere beyond those hedges, the roses still stood guard. Tomorrow, she whispered, we end this. Julie met her eyes. Are you ready? Madeline nodded. She'd been torn down, shamed, erased from her own family's legacy. But her father had seen her strength even when no one else had. And now, armed with truth, with witnesses, and with undeniable evidence, she would do what they never expected. Not survive, reclaim. She crossed the room and reached for the letter still sitting on the windowsill. Her father's final note. You were never meant to be the pawn, Madeline. It read, you were always the queen. Make the move that ends their game. She folded it gently, slid it into her pocket, and turned back toward the table. It was time. The estate was already buzzing before sunrise. Black SUVs lined the driveway. A full camera crew unloaded equipment, while a makeup artist adjusted lighting inside the parlor. Sierra had orchestrated it all. The grand media gesture, the curated outfits, the controlled narrative of inheritance and new beginnings. To the outside world, today was a tribute to legacy. To Madeline, it was war. She watched from the second-floor landing, hidden just beyond the railing. Sierra was downstairs in a sleek black sheath dress, rehearsing lines with the director as if the will reading were an Oscar-winning performance. This shot, Sierra told a cameraman, pointing toward the French doors, should capture me opening the envelope. The light behind me. Symbolic, you know. James stood off to the side, fiddling with his tie, looking nauseated. He hadn't spoken much in recent days, Madeline noted. Guilt had a way of making noise feel unbearable. Julie arrived through the front entrance precisely at 8. O'clock I am, clutching her leather briefcase like it contained a detonator, which in a way it did. Inside were the documents, the recordings, and the sealed cartels. Her father's last safeguard. Julie glanced up the staircase, caught Madeline's eye, and gave the subtlest nod. Madeline came down slowly. The noise dimmed. All heads turned. The cameras, momentarily idle, followed her descent like a queen returning to a throne she'd been exiled from. Sierra's smile stiffened. Well, she said too brightly, look who's finally decided to join the family gathering. Don't let me interrupt, Madeline replied smoothly. I'm sure the lighting is just right. Julie stepped between them. Shall we begin? They moved into the formal study where the will was to be read. Madeline took the seat at the end of the long table, her back to the window where her father's garden was just visible. Those same white roses blooming beyond the glass, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. The camera crew adjusted lenses and angles. Boom mics hovered overhead. Julie opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked Whitmore, Last Will and Testament. Her voice was calm and steady as she addressed the room as the legal executor of Thomas Whitmore's estate. I will read the terms of his final will and any attached clauses per Connecticut probate law. Sierra reached for James' hand, squeezing it with theatrical tenderness. Julie began. The room stayed quiet as she detailed the primary allocations. 70% of was the Whitmore estate to Madeline, 30%, including partial business shares and property interest, to James Cross and Sierra Holt. Madeline kept her expression neutral. Sierra exhaled like a queen just crowned. I knew he wouldn't leave us out. But Julie didn't close the folder. She reached for the sealed envelope beside it. "There is an additional provision," she said, her tone shifting. "A supplemental clause added to the will 2 days before Mr. Whitmore's passing. It's called a cotel." Sierra's brow furrowed. "A what?" Julie broke the seal and read, "Any individual who accepts an inheritance from this will agrees to immediate release and public disclosure of any pre-existing evidence of fraud, coercion, or undue influence connected to this estate." The room rose. Julie laid out the folder. Photos, bank statements, the printed email thread where Sierra discussed timing the media push, and then, finally, the flash drive. "This contains video of Ms. Holt attempting to bribe Mr. Whitmore's nurse," Julie said, inserting the drive into a monitor, "and of conversations implicating both her and Mr. Cross in a planned challenge to the legitimacy of this will." Sierra stood so fast her chair fell back with a loud crack. "Turn those cameras off!" she shrieked. "No," Madeline said, rising from her seat, voice like steel. "You wanted a show, let's give them one." The screen flickered to life. There, captured in stark resolution, was Sierra. Jennifer handing a thick envelope to the nurse. In the guest hallway, her voice hushed but clear. Just say he was confused, that he called her by the wrong name. Anything that makes the new will look unstable. The nurse hesitated in the footage, asking if it was legal. Sierra's voice snapped back. "You want to keep your job, don't you?" Gasps echoed around the study. The cameraman instinctively zoomed in on Sierra's face as she stood frozen, her expression curdling from fury to fear. James remained seated, pale as the envelope in Julie's hand. Madeline's gaze didn't shift. She had waited 2 years for this moment, not just to reclaim the estate, but to reclaim her name. Julie's voice cut through the tension. "The castle was legally registered. Everyone who has accepted any part of the estate has now triggered it. This evidence will be submitted to the probate court and, per the terms, to state authorities." Sierra slammed her palm onto the table. "This is entrapment. It's illegal. This whole thing is a setup." "No," Julie said calmly, rising to full height. "It's a trap. That's different, and it was set by a man who knew exactly what you were the moment you walked through his door." Sierra turned to James. "Say something. Tell him this isn't true." But James was shaking. He reached for the photo still lying in front of him. One showing him walking into the office of a rival company while carrying a Whitmore contract. His shoulders slumped. "It is true," he muttered, "all of it." Sierra's voice cracked. "You coward." "No," Madeline said, stepping closer. "He's just finally seeing the truth." Sierra spun toward her, eyes blazing. "You think you've won? You think this is over? I made your husband leave you. I tore your marriage apart. I was going to make this house mine. Your father's company mine." Julie reached into the final folder and hit a button on the laptop. The final video began. Thomas Whitmore, seated in this very room, speaking directly to the camera. "If you're watching this," he said, voice hoarse but deliberate, "then you've finally revealed who you really are. Greed is a poor teacher, but consequences are excellent." Sierra's face drained of color. "I trusted you for a time," Thomas continued, "but I also researched you, and I built this wall of truth around my daughter, around the legacy you tried to poison." He leaned forward in the recording. "And Jennifer, you lose." At that moment, 2 officers appeared at the entrance of the study. Their badges glinted under the chandelier light. "Miss Anist," one said, using her real name, "we'd like you to come with us. There's an active investigation regarding interstate fraud, financial coercion, and obstruction of inheritance law." Sierra backed away. "You don't have jurisdiction." "We do now," the officer replied, showing a signed warrant. "Your aliases and business records were flagged by federal authorities this morning." Madeline watched as Sierra was cuffed, her protests turning into shrill pleas. Cameras continued to roll. "You'll regret this," she shouted as they led her away. "All of you." "No," Madeline said softly, almost to herself. We already did. Now it's your turn." As the door shut behind Sierra, the room remained still. Outside, news vans were already pulling up. The Whitmore estate had become headline fodder. Julie exhaled. "It's done." Madeline shook her head. "No, it's only just begun." By noon, the estate was surrounded by flashing lights and live broadcast trucks. The chaos outside had the air of a political scandal, not a family betrayal. Reporters swarmed the gates with microphones. Drones buzzed overhead for aerial shots of the once imposing Whitmore estate, and headlines blinked across every major channel. Heiress exposed fraud at inheritance reading. Woman arrested for multi-state scam. Inside, the house was quiet again, but it was no longer peaceful. Madeline stood in the study, the same room where her father had faced Sierra. Jennifer Anist, the flash drive, the recordings, the coda song. They had all worked. Her father's plan had not just held, it had detonated with precision. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt exhausted. Julie entered the room with a phone to her ear, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. "Henry," followed behind her, carrying a cardboard box marked Greenhouse Private. His sleeves were rolled up and his tie gone. He looked like he'd aged 5 years and 5 hours. "They've confirmed her aliases," Julie said, hanging up. Jennifer Anist was her legal name until 2012. She disappeared after a fraud conviction in California, changed identities twice, and moved through 3 states targeting families with elderly patriarchs and unsettled estates. "Serial predator," Henry muttered, charming the dying. "She's not just a con artist," Julie said. "She's an architect of ruin." Madeline crossed the room and placed a hand on the box Henry had brought. "What's this?" He gave a sheepish smile. "Something I found in the greenhouse. Dad kept it hidden beneath the orchid shelf." She lifted the lid carefully. Inside was a worn, leather-bound journal. Her father's handwriting lined the pages in his familiar tight scrawl. Julie leaned closer as Madeline flipped through the entries. They weren't reflections. They were records, targets, observations, conversations, dates, photos stapled between pages, blurry shots of Sierra speaking with lawyers, bank documents showing transfers to unfamiliar shell company, pages of notes about her routines, aliases, and inconsistencies. "This isn't a journal," Julie whispered. "It's a case file." "He knew," Madeline said, "from the beginning." Henry stepped forward. "There's more. The FBI found documents in her apartment. She's done this before, at least 3 other families. They're opening a joint case, and they want to use Dad's journal to tie it all together." Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she turned another page. There, near the middle, was a photo of her and Henry, taken when they were kids, sitting beneath the West Garden arch. Beneath it, her father had written, "They won't see it now, but one day she'll rebuild what they tried to tear down. That's the legacy I believe in." Julie placed a hand gently on Madeline's shoulder. "Your father didn't just protect your future," she said. "He protected the truth for all the families she preyed on." Madeline nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then, we owe it to him to finish it." Julie looked at the flash drive still plugged into her laptop. "The district attorney agrees. They want full cooperation. With what we've uncovered, she's not facing just fraud anymore. She's looking at federal conspiracy." Henry exhaled. "What about James?" Madeline turned toward the door, her expression unreadable. "Let him speak. I want to hear what he says when the woman he betrayed me for is gone, and there's no one left to script his lines." James sat in the guest lounge of the district courthouse, flanked by 2 federal agents and a defense attorney who looked 10 years younger than the moment he walked in. He didn't look up as Madeline entered the room. The window behind him framed a gray afternoon, overcast and restless, as if the sky itself emerged to settle. She took the seat across from him and folded her hands in her lap. No guards, no lawyers between them, just silence, thick and waiting. He finally spoke. "I didn't know about the others." Madeline said nothing. "I knew Sierra, Jennifer, was hiding things, but I didn't know how far it went, not until your father confronted me 2 months ago." She raised an eyebrow, her voice low. "And what did he say?" James swallowed. "He told me he'd seen it before, that there were patterns, money disappearing, forged signatures, quiet manipulation. He told me she was planning to erase you." Madeline's stomach twisted, but she didn't let it show. "And what did you do with that information?" "I froze," he admitted. "I didn't protect you. I didn't stop her. But I didn't help her destroy him either." "You stood beside her at the funeral," Madeline said flatly. James looked down. "Because she told me. If I didn't, she'd tell the media I forged contracts, that I leaked confidential documents to the competitors. I panicked." Madeline stared at him. The shape of him so familiar and yet utterly foreign now, his crisp suit, the faint scar under his jaw from a bike accident when they were 24. The man she once trusted with everything. "I told the FBI everything," he said. "All of it. Emails, voice messages. I gave them access to my old phone." She watched him closely. "Why?" "Now." "Because she's gone," he answered quietly. "And because I finally understood what I destroyed." A long pause stretched between them. Madeline stood, circling slowly to the window, hands clasped behind her back. "You had a choice," she said. "Every day you had a choice, and you made the wrong one over and over until the only reason you're speaking now is because you're alone and afraid." He didn't deny it. "I don't want your apology," she continued, "and I don't want you near anything my father left behind. But I want the truth, on record and in detail. Not just for me. For the families she conned before us. For the ones who don't have evidence. The ones whose names won't make the news." James nodded, voice tight. "You'll have it." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Do you remember what Dad used to say when we messed up his garden as kids?" He looked up. "That the strongest roses grew where the roots had to fight for light." Madeline opened the door. "Then it's time for something new to grow." Outside the courthouse, Henry waited in her car. The radio was on low, playing an old Sam Cooke song their father loved. She slid into the passenger seat, closed the door, and sat still for a long moment. "How'd it go?" he asked. "He told the truth," she said, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. "Or just enough of it to matter." "Do you believe him?" Madeline shook her head. "Does it matter? It's no longer about belief. It's about proof, and we have it." Henry pulled away from the curb, and as the courthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, Madeline felt something she hadn't in years. Space. Not relief, not peace, but space. A clearing, and in it, something waiting to bloom. The greenhouse had been locked since her father died. Madeline stood outside it now, fingers wrapped around the rusted key he left behind. For weeks, everything had been about unraveling the past, digging up records, confronting liars, assembling what had been shattered. But this place wasn't about exposing something broken. It was about beginning again. She turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. Warm, humid air greeted her like breath, laced with the soft perfume of blooming orchids. The sun filtered in through high glass panels, streaking the space with gold and green. Every shelf was still in place. The orchids, her father's favorite, were alive, thriving. Someone had cared for them while the rest of the estate fell into chaos. Henry. It had to be. She crossed the room slowly, running her fingers along a wooden workbench worn smooth with time. On it sat a sealed envelope, her name written in her father's hand. Again. Madeline sat down and opened it. My dearest Lauren, if you're reading this, the truth has been told, the damage faced and the roots rebalanced. I'm proud of you, and not just for winning, for staying kind while walking through fire. This greenhouse was never about plants, it was about peace. That's why I bought the empty lot next to your flower shop 2 years ago. I couldn't protect you from what happened, but I could give you soil to begin again. The deed is enclosed. So is your future. Build something no one can take from you, something that will outlive their betrayal. Some flowers only bloom after frost. You are one of them. Love, always, Dad. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the second page, a property deed, legally notarized and stamped, signed with her father's name. She sat there for a long time staring at it, letting the truth of it settle. He had seen it all coming. The lies, the betrayal, the battle. And he hadn't just set traps. He had laid a foundation. Julie and Henry were waiting in the kitchen when Madeline returned. She set the deed on the counter without a word. Henry leaned in first, eyes wide. Next to the shop? He asked. Madeline nodded. He bought it after Sierra moved in. Julie scanned the page quickly, then looked up. He registered Jeremy Gardens as an LLC, 7 months before he passed. What? Madeline whispered. It's already a business, Julie said. Licenses filed, permits cleared. There's even a pending grant from the city for urban renewal. He didn't just want you to restart, he prepared the entire runway. Henry opened a folder from his own satchel. There's more. Look. Inside were mock-ups, brand colors, a logo, a tagline, where things come back to life. Madeline blinked at it, chest tightening with the kind of ache that wasn't pain but something else, recognition. The life her father had imagined. A garden not just of flowers but of rebirth. She sank into a chair and exhaled. It wasn't about revenge, she said. Not really. Julie smiled softly. It was about reclamation. Henry placed his hand over hers. Let's build it, he said, and for the first time in years, Madeline didn't hesitate. She nodded. Let's begin. The grand opening of Jeremy Gardens came on the first warm Saturday of spring. Sunlight spilled across the renovated lot beside her old shop, where rows of planters lined the walkway, each one filled with blooming flowers her father once nurtured in the greenhouse. White roses, deep purple orchids, lavender and sage. It smelled like the memory of peace and the promise of something better. Madeline stood beneath a simple white awning holding a pair of garden shears instead of a ceremonial ribbon cutter. Her hands were steady now. No trembling, no hesitation. The cameras were back, but this time they weren't here for scandal. They were here to witness something grow. Julie stood beside her, a clipboard tucked under one arm, dressed in tailored navy and that familiar expression of quiet pride. Channel 7's going live in 2 minutes, she said, glancing at the crew setting up down the path. But take your time. Henry emerged from the back garden with a wheelbarrow full of potted seedlings. His sleeves were rolled, face flushed with work and sun. He looked like someone who had finally stopped running from guilt and started planting atonement instead. You ready? He called. Madeline looked at the wooden sign they'd installed that morning, Jeremy Gardens Community Restoration Project. Beneath it, a smaller plaque in bronze, for Thomas Whitmore, who believed in growth even when it hurt. She turned to the growing crowd. Neighbors, volunteers, city officials, families from other states who had reached out after reading about Jennifer Anist's arrest. Survivors of the same woman, the same con, the same kind of silence. Many of them stood together now, hands clasped or arms linked, none of them alone anymore. Madeline stepped up to the microphone. "I'm not going to make a long speech," she said, voice calm, strong, "because what we're building here isn't about what was taken. It's about what we choose to plant in the space it left behind." She paused, her eyes landing on the garden bed nearest the front gate. White roses, just beginning to open. "This is more than a flower project. It's a restoration. Of land, yes, but also of people, of truth, of what it means to rebuild when the world has tried to convince you you're broken." A hush settled. Even the camera crew stood still. "My father believed that roots matter, that the past is worth honoring, but not worth being buried under. He didn't just leave me a legacy, he left me a lesson." She raised the garden shears, clipped the first branch of the rose bush, and let it fall gently into the soil. "We bloom anyway." Applause rose, genuine and full, sweeping over her like wind through the garden. Julie stepped forward to speak with the press. Henry returned to helping an elderly couple pick out starter plants. And Madeline? She wandered to the far edge of the lot, where a bench faced the city skyline. On it, etched into the backrest, was a final line from her father's journal: "Some flowers bloom best in broken places." She sat down, the sun warm on her shoulders. Across the street, people passed by without knowing the war this space had witnessed, the deception, the pain, the reclaiming. She didn't need them to know. She was no longer a woman trying to prove what had been done to her. She was something else now. A gardener, a builder, a daughter who refused to inherit silence. And as the wind rustled the leaves and petals beside her, Madeline smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because something was finally beginning from the ground up. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Jeremy Gardens was never just a story about betrayal, inheritance, or even justice. It was about the quiet resilience of those who are underestimated, overlooked, or erased by the very people who should have protected them. It's about finding the courage to return, not for revenge, but for truth, and in the process, to rebuild something stronger, something that cannot be stolen. To everyone who has ever been cast aside, made to question their worth, or told that silence is survival, this story is for you. Madeline's victory was not in exposing her enemies, but in choosing to plant something new in the place they tried to burn down. That is, the power of reclamation. A heartfelt thank you to all our viewers, especially those who've walked through their own difficult seasons and are still standing, still blooming. Your presence here means more than you know. To the survivors, the rebuilders, the daughters and sons who refuse to inherit bitterness, we see you, and we believe in the world you're making. As you close this video, we invite you to carry one thing with you. Some flowers bloom best in broken places. Let that be your reminder that every ending holds a seed. Until next time, keep growing, keep speaking, and above all, keep choosing the life that was always yours to reclaim, with gratitude,